Museum of Anthropology at UBC, and we're in the conservation laboratory here. And I'm one of the two conservators. My name is Heidi Swierenga. The conservation function of the museum is kind of encompasses a lot of different elements. We have the really huge privilege of being able to work with materials here that belong to the communities along the Northwest Coast as well as from the rest of the world. And for us, one of the things that we focus on is the value of the pieces beyond just the physical piece itself. So we learn a lot from the communities that we work with, from where these pieces came from, about the proper ways to care for them, and what is most important about those pieces. And sometimes that may be using the piece in ceremony, using it for different events. So often we'll travel collections outside of the museum to communities in order for those processes to happen. And to do that, it's a very interesting collaborative experience where we're working with the family members who have the rights and privileges to use these pieces, and also sometimes artists. And we work together to modify them and strengthen them so that they can be suitably used and safely used in performance. But that's one thing. The other thing that we do a lot is on the preventive side, which is probably 90% of our work here, is we make sure that the environment in which the collections are housed is safe so that we can prevent future damage. And it's kind of like being responsible for the checkups as opposed to having to send objects to surgery. We want to stop the damage before it occurs. So we care about the temperature, we care about the humidity, we care about the lighting, many, many different things that we can work with and mitigate against creating damage to the pieces. And one of the other big things that we do here is around exhibit preparation. So we're primarily exhibit driven. So any treatment work that we do other than preparing materials for use outside of the museum is getting the collections ready for display. And when that happens, it's a very intensive, focused effort. And we'll be doing a lot of bench work for a few months at a time. And then it stops and we can go back to our other projects. There's an ebb and flow in what we do. So the pieces that we have here is an example of what we call a collections visit. So a visit might occur inside of the institution by a researcher. And when we talk about researchers, we're talking about a whole category of researchers. So it might be a scholarly researcher, it might be a student who's in school at an undergraduate level or a high school level, but a lot of time that researcher can be a community member who wants to know more about processes and techniques that were used in the artistic tradition that they're now trying to recreate or carry forward. And this is an example of a collection of baskets from the Squamish-Lillooet area up around the Whistler area of British Columbia that we took earlier this week. We packed them up, loaded them into a van where we were able to participate in an event that was hosted by the Squamish-Lillooet Cultural Center. And it was a day of visits by basketry makers, students of basketry, weaving, family who their grandmothers and aunties had been basket makers. And we took them up there, and it was just a wonderful day of visiting and connecting with the belongings here. And it was lovely. People would be picking them up and saying, my great-grandmother made this, or my auntie made this. And it really saw the connection that is so strong and important that people have to these belongings. And just by being able to hold them, look at them closely, it sparks the stories and the memories, and it creates a wonderful sharing experience. And this is just one example. I think this is a really easy one because there really wasn't anything that had to happen from a conservation perspective in terms of treatments. Everything was safe to travel as it currently is. We just had to do condition reporting And we just kind of create a benchmark of what the piece looked like before it left and then what it looks like when it comes back. But often the process might be much, much more intensive, where we have to do quite a bit of work, or we work with an artist to make modifications to strengthen them so that they can be used, especially if it's going to be danced. Because if something is danced, then it has to be able to withstand potentially a lot of pressures and forces, and everybody who's participating wants to make sure that nothing goes wrong, that no pieces fall off. It would be very embarrassing for everybody involved.
And how do you feel about these relationships that you may have with artists or knowledge keepers?
The connections that we have with the knowledge keepers is critical. There's no way that we could do the work that we do without their guidance. And if we didn't have that engagement, these pieces would just be sitting in storage. They would just be sitting in the cases. And there's some value in that. They're available for people to see, visitors, researchers, but it's very stagnant, and it's nowhere near as important as it can be when you're working with the people who actually have a direct link to the belongings. And it's like the next and more important part of that piece's life. Yes, it sits in a museum, but it has so much information and value and importance that isn't necessarily apparent to the regular visitor walking by. And if we had no connection, we wouldn't be knowledgeable of that level of information. And the piece wouldn't be able to travel. It wouldn't be able to break out from the museum. So I guess the bottom line is we're here, our function is primarily to support these activities and to enable them to happen. So often there might be questions when a request is made as to whether or not it's okay to do this. And our job is to say, okay, well, we think it's going to be okay, but let's work together to figure out how we can make sure it's okay. And sometimes it never is okay, because if you take the example of a headdress, perhaps there's too much missing. Sometimes we can put the ties back on, we can recreate the rigging. Missing elements can be created by the artist involved. But if there's a significant portion of the structure that's gone, then the dancer might say, we can't do it. There's not enough there to work with. So the group may decide instead just to bring it so that it can be seen and experienced by the people who are there, experienced in a slightly different way. One of the most wonderful outcomes of these visits that we do is we learn a lot. So the idea is we take them to communities so that the artists and the students can learn, but the bonus is that we as conservators and also the curators learn as well. So just one example is when you hear a master artist or a master weaver or just a student of weaving talk about these pieces, they get so enthralled about what's going on, and they'll talk about the different weaving techniques that are used, which is something that I may not notice myself because I do not have as much experience and I'm not engaged in the practice. Not until I could weave a basket like this would I be on that same level. So I am always a student, and I'm always listening about what they can share. And for example, so one of the things that they would talk about with this piece is the fact that there are so many different materials involved. There's bark, cedar root, cedar bark, cherry bark, canary grass for the lighter materials. And one of the errors that people often make is they assume that there are dyes with these, used with these. And they're not. You'll see that there's 3 different colors, but the lighter red is cherry bark, but the darker red is cherry bark as well. And it's not been dyed. It's undergone a process where it's buried with moisture, and it oxidizes and it darkens the material, so then they've got these different colors to work with. And then the white is the canary grass. And it just goes on and on about different techniques, and often there's also stories to be told around the different design elements and how you can recognize the work of one weaver based on the designs that are in those pieces. And if you can't recognize the hand of the individual weaver, then you might be able to identify where that piece came from, because different design elements will characteristically come from different areas, although they did cross around a bit as people traveled. But it's hearing it in the context of a current practice that is so important, because some of these pieces are older and they were made by the grandmothers, the great-grandmothers of the people who are weaving now, but the granddaughters are doing that weaving now and learning from the pieces that were made by members of their family. So it again is it's a pushback against that idea that these are older pieces that people aren't doing this anymore. Well, they're totally doing this right now, and it's really exciting to be able to be involved in that process where we're providing kind of learning tools to keep that learning process going and that tradition going. Basically, it feels like a massive privilege to be able to support that.
You talked about sort of the provenance, or that you can retrieve who made the basket from the design?
Well, loosely speaking. So our catalog records, and for that you should really talk to the collections manager, but our catalog records have a certain amount of information in them. If we're lucky, they have a lot of information, and if we're unlucky, there's almost no information. And when we're really lucky, we'll have the location from which it came, and the known artist is something that we really, really want to know. And often that information doesn't exist because they may have been sold, traveled through different hands, and that information is lost. It's been disassociated from the object. Or at the time when it was purchased, it wasn't important for whoever was purchasing it to actually understand who made it. But now we value that quite a lot. So one of the records that we had a big question mark beside the name of the possible weaver. And then when we were there, that basket was seen by a relative, and they said, "Oh no, it's the wrong name. This absolutely was done by this person." And so we're able to write that in and make the corrections, and we bring that back and we update our own database, because we see that database as something that's very much a living thing. It is always changing. So we welcome the corrections and additions wherever we can find them, and this is one of those great opportunities to get those corrections made.
And is provenance still important for a museum, or you?
I think
conservator?
it's important to everybody. The makers of these pieces in particular, they want to know. They really want to know who made them, so they can find their own connections. And when the catalog record arrives and they look at it and they say, "Oh, you don't know where it's made." Oh, there's less that can be offered. There's less that can be enjoyed. It's a much different situation if you know it was made by your great grandmother than by a question mark. That it's harder to create that connection. And I mean, for us in conservation, when we talk about conservation, we talk about the deterioration of things falling under the agents of deterioration. And there's about 10 to 12 depending on how you break those up. And one of the agents of deterioration is disassociation. Disassociation is the loss of information about a piece, be it a natural history specimen or a belonging that belongs to a cultural group. And when you don't have a connection between the physical piece and the information about that piece, there is less value. And I don't mean monetary value, I just mean value writ large in terms of what can be shared and what can be learned. When we do materials identification, a lot of it is kind of knowing what you know and knowing what is usually used in the creation of something. So with a collection like this, I mean, these are just 24 pieces of a much larger collection. But we know they all look mostly similar. There's a couple of exceptions here. And we know they're all from the same area. So we can say with confidence that there's cedar root, cedar bark, cherry bark, canary grass, because that's what was primarily used in that area, in this tradition. But when we don't know, then there are a whole bunch of different analytical techniques that we can use to try to identify what's going on. And a lot of that is microscopic investigation, just with visible light microscopy. But if we need to get in a little bit deeper into the structure, then we might do scanning electron microscopy, where you're looking more at the cellular structure. That's a destructive technique though, so we wouldn't do that just for fun. We would do that if there's a reasonable sample to make, something that's fallen off. We take sampling, the issue of sampling and destructive testing quite seriously. We have non-destructive techniques that are available to us, such as X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, and that's when we're looking at the different elements. So if I had a metal and I wanted to know if it was a local metal or something that had been traded from Europe, I could tell that just by doing an analysis. I can't tell what the composition is with that technique, but I can tell all of the materials that are in that metal, and just by that I can map that to whether it was local or not local. But there's a whole bunch of different resources that are available to us, investigative resources, that kind of make it like a fun puzzle. And the challenge is gaining access to those resources. So we have a few here. Luckily, we're on the UBC campus, so we have access to a few others, and then we have colleagues that we can connect with, like at the Canadian Conservation Institute, where they have the scientific laboratory, and they actually have the field of conservation science also at that institution. So there's lots of different strings to pull in around that. It's hard to be a material expert in absolutely everything, and so often we will start at a base and then have to do a little bit of work to connect in at a deeper level, using what resources we can, and borrowing and stealing the brain power of other people. We just did, I just did a school tour yesterday with a grade 6-7 class, and we went into the storage area and I showed them the mysteries of conservation. It's like, look what happens when you do this to something, and it just blew their minds. We do a lot of teaching here at MOA. We teach classes on conservation, conservation of organic and conservation of inorganic materials. And we break it up into digestible chunks for the students, and we talk about those agents of deterioration. And I've got a couple examples here that are my absolute favorite examples. And there are two different agents of deterioration. And the first one is light. So this is a wonderful story of the doll that was lost. It's been in our collection for several decades, and at one point it was lost. Couldn't find it anywhere, and people were going by a little black and white picture of what it looked like when it first came into the collection, and they were looking for a doll in a black dress. And it was in our old visible storage cases, and they were lit with very terrible lights according to conservation standards. They were very bright fluorescent lights. So they not only emitted a high level of visible radiation, but also UV radiation. And that's a double whammy for anything that's light sensitive. And so it wasn't until a full survey was done of the collection that they found a doll that we didn't know we had, which was a gray doll. And it turned out that there had just been a lot of damage that had happened over the decades that the piece was inside that case under those lighting levels, because the one additional challenge that we have is that a large portion of our collection is on permanent display in our visible storage galleries. now it's the Multiversity Gallery. We've done a big update, big renovation, so the lighting is better. We have a very strict lighting rotation program for light-sensitive materials. But 20 years ago, we didn't have that. So here, when they finally discovered what had happened, you can see how dark it is in the areas where the light didn't hit. And then it was, pardon the pun, but it was like a light bulb went on, and we realized the damage that had been happening under our care. And that agent of deterioration is custodial neglect. When we found this, we immediately ran around and looked for all of the other materials that might have suffered the same fate, and we found quite a number of gray silk, pieces that were made of gray silk, and so all of those had been damaged because of the light levels. But we learned a lot, and we've absolutely adjusted our practices and our policies, and I think you have to be able to see the value in this. Damage did happen, but it really mobilized our efforts around the proper care and protocol around lighting, and it influenced our future exhibit design because of that. So the other example that I have here is a different agent of deterioration, and it's fascinating because it was a bit of a puzzle because of a different reason. And here we have a large area of discoloration which has occurred on a rather modern material on a skirt from Korea. And here you'd think it was fading, but this was on the inside of a hanger. So it was folded over, and this would have always been dark. So we knew it wasn't light, but the discoloration was the result of something else. So we immediately started connecting with our colleagues at the Canadian Conservation Institute to find out if they might have any ideas about what happened. And sure enough, they said it looked like fume fading to them. And with their help, we did a little bit of research, and we started looking at the materials that we were using to create our hangers. And it turns out that there are two different types of polyester non-woven batting, which is the soft stuff that you use to pad out hangers. One type is from the fabric shop, and it's bound with adhesive, PBA adhesive, just like you would find in a white glue that kids would use in school, and it's very acidic. The other kind is bound with heat, thermally bound. And we looked at our material under the microscope, and we could actually see the little blobs of resin. So that is the result of the interaction between the acids and the adhesive in the batting and the dyes in the fabric. So again, this was something that happened a long, long time ago. And because of it, a great learning opportunity, created a wonderful teaching example to students in conservation. And we immediately did a complete campaign and separated out all of what we call the bad batting and make sure it was disposed of, and then everything has been upgraded and replaced. So it's like this constant learning cycle for everybody involved. And yeah, it's custodial neglect, but it's also, the other agent is pollutants. So the pollutants not necessarily coming from the environment, but also pollutants that come from the objects themselves, and also from the materials that are housing those objects.